This is a story about the car that came out of nowhere and changed my life forever. It was mid-afternoon on a weekend, and I remember the sky was particularly gray and drizzly. My son and I were in the car, talking about baseball as we drove home from the grocery store. 1 minute, everything was fine. My son was smiling as he chatted away, and I was listening to him while keeping my eyes on the road. The next, something red flashed in front of us, and I slammed down on the brakes. But I wasn't fast enough. Everything after that happened so fast. There was a resounding crash, and the impact threw my son and I back in our seats. Glass cascaded all around us, and I heard the sound of metal tearing and crunching. Every part of my body hurt, even as the airbag attempted to cushion the blow. All I could do was grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, waiting for it all to be over. And right beside me was my son, screaming at the top of his lungs in pure pain and terror. I don't think I'll ever forget that sound, as long as I live. At some point, the car flipped over, but I was already unconscious by then. I woke up when the paramedics were removing me from the wreckage of our car. I couldn't move my left arm, and I was pretty positive it was broken. There was pain everywhere as the paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher, but I didn't care as I screamed for my son. I just wanted to know that my son was okay.
Calm down. He's on his way to the hospital already,
I was told by one of the paramedics. As they folded the legs of the stretcher beneath me and lifted me into the ambulance, I saw him, the monster responsible for this. He was sitting next to his car, crying. As far as I could see, apart from a scratch on his forehead, he was uninjured. Hot, painful tears began to stream down my cheeks, and I turned my head away, too disgusted to even look at him anymore. The whole ride to the hospital, I only had one thing on my mind. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that he was the one who went through the red light, and he only walked away with a scratch. My son and I had done nothing to deserve this. It was 5 hours before I saw my son again. It was supposed to be his birthday next week. He was supposed to be turning 9. I kept thinking what terrible timing this all was. He was supposed to be excited, getting ready for his party, trying to guess his presents. He should be living like a normal 9-year-old, not in the hospital because of someone else's carelessness. They wheeled me into his room, and my heart just sank. His head was bandaged, and he had a ventilator breathing for him. He wouldn't open his eyes or respond to me. It was like I'd already lost him. The next day, I got the news I had been dreading. A parent's worst nightmare. My son would never see his 9th birthday. He was brain dead. There was no coming back from that. No chance of recovery. I had to make the call to take him off of life support. The news broke me. I remember staggering around his room, too numb to walk, grasping at the bed handle to prevent my knees from buckling underneath me. I was hysterical. My son, my baby, was gone. I'm going to skip forward to a week after the funeral. I had taken leave from work to deal with my grief. At first, I was thankful for the bereavement leave, but after a few days, I started to curse it. I thought what I needed was some time alone to process everything, but I was wrong. Being alone meant I was stuck in my head all the time. The same thoughts overwhelmed me, the same feelings of guilt and grief. In my head, all I saw was the crash. My son lying in the hospital bed on the ventilator, and the last breath he ever took. The middle of the night, at some point during that week, was the first time something happened. I woke up to one of my son's toys going off. It was one of his cars that made a siren noise when you pushed it. Startled and confused, I simply laid there in bed, listening with my eyes wide open until the siren eventually stopped. After a few minutes, I finally managed to control my trembling hands and take a few deep breaths and mustered up the courage to go and investigate. I slipped out of the covers and tiptoed barefoot to his room. Instead of going inside, I paused outside of his door and just listened, holding my breath. Inside, it sounded like someone was playing with his cars. I could hear them clinking together as if someone was banging them into each other. I didn't understand at first what I was hearing. Was I imagining it? But it sounded clear as day, as though someone was inside my son's bedroom, playing with his toys. Sucking in another deep breath, I opened the door as fast as I could and switched the light on. There was nobody inside. But on the floor, about 2 feet in front of me, was a red car, a fire truck, and a black car. A few days before this, I had gone into his room and made his bed, and picked up all of his toys and placed them into the bins in the closet. I was certain I hadn't missed any, and I'd shut the door after me. I couldn't bear walking past his room and seeing how empty it was. But if I'd put his toys away, and I was certain I had gotten them all, then why were they on his floor right now? Who had put them there? Toys didn't just jump out of closets all on their own. I held back tears as I picked the toys up and placed them back inside his closet, making sure the door was shut tight. Then I scanned the room carefully to make sure nothing else was out of place. His clothes and shoes were all put away, and his bed was still made. Even his iPad sat untouched on the headboard shelf. I shook away my confusion, trying to convince myself that I must have simply forgotten to put them away. My head wasn't exactly at a great place, and it wasn't completely impossible I had missed them. I gave the room one last glance, then turned the light back off and carefully shut the door behind me. A few more weeks went by without anything unusual happening. I'd finally reopened my son's door, and I would sometimes go inside his room and sit on his bed, talking out loud as though he was still there with me. It brought me a sense of comfort in a way. One night, I'd just come home from work and was putting some laundry away. The towel closet is right outside my son's room, on the other side of the hallway. As I was loading the shelves with the towels, I heard something fall to the floor behind me, coming from inside my son's room. I shut the towel closet, turned around slowly, and walked into his room. On the floor at the side of his bed was his iPad. It had been sitting on the middle shelf of his headboard, far away from the edge. Far enough that someone would have had to smack it very hard to get it to land where it did. It definitely couldn't have fallen there on its own. I picked it up and placed it back where it had been, cautiously inspecting the room. I was starting to feel as though I was being watched, like I wasn't alone there. And I began to consider the possibility that someone had broken into the house while I had been at work. Trying not to appear too panicked, I went to the kitchen and grabbed a knife from the drawer, just in case. Then I went through every room, checking any hiding places and making sure all of the windows and doors were locked. There was no sign of a break-in, and no other evidence that someone could be inside the house. I was starting to think I was going crazy. Although I tried to tell myself there were probably perfectly rational reasons for the things that had happened, I still couldn't shake away the feeling that something was definitely going on. This was finally confirmed a few months later, when another incident occurred. This one is what finally got me wondering if my son was still around somehow. I had just gotten home from work again and was making dinner. I wanted something easy and quick, so I settled for mac and cheese. I set my plate on the table at the spot I normally sat, then grabbed my cup and went to the fridge to fill it with some ice. After I had gotten my ice and some soda, I went back to the table to sit down, but something made me pause. My plate was no longer sitting at my usual spot. Instead, it was further down the table, at my son's usual place. I looked between the spot I had put the plate to where it was now in disbelief. I knew I wasn't going crazy. The plate had definitely moved. Trying to stay calm, I moved the plate back to my spot and sat down. But I couldn't just ignore what had happened. So after a few bites, I decided to do a test. I got up from the table, leaving my plate where it was, and went down the hallway to the bathroom. I shut the door and waited for a couple of minutes before returning to the table. As expected, the plate had moved again. It was now sitting right in front of the seat my son always chose. Tears formed in my eyes again as I sat down, staring at the empty chair my plate was now sitting in front of. I smiled and said, "Hello, Tucker." I sat there in silence for at least 20 minutes, unable to move or even eat any more of my dinner. I just stared at the chair and wondered if my son really was still here with me. This is the story of the worst day of my life and the strange incidents that followed. I still notice that things move around the house from time to time. I'm not scared of it anymore, though, and I've learned to accept it as the way things are now. I normally just shrug it off as, that's just Tucker being Tucker. When my brother was 18, he died in a car accident. I was 16 at the time, and I was devastated. Over the course of the last 2 years in my parents' home, I have had several experiences where I felt as though he was trying to communicate with me. The first time it happened was in the middle of the night. I'd woken up from a nightmare and decided to go downstairs to get a glass of water and calm myself down. At the time, my brother's ashes were sitting on the fireplace mantel in the living room, which was located to the right of the kitchen. The door between the two rooms was usually open, so you could see into the living room quite clearly on the way to the kitchen. I had not turned any lights on in the house as I was trying not to wake my parents, whose bedroom was also downstairs. So I was halfway to the kitchen, walking through the near-complete darkness, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw the black silhouette of a person standing in the living room, right by the fireplace where my brother's urn was. I was still a little spooked from the nightmare I just had, so I hurried to the kitchen and flipped on the light switch as quickly as I could. When I turned back and looked through the door to the fireplace, the silhouette was gone. Even though it was dark, I was sure there had been someone standing there. I found myself wondering if it had been my brother. They had been standing directly beside the urn that held his ashes. And as the days passed, and I went over the moment in my head, I realized that the shadow had been the same height and build that my brother had been. I convinced myself it had been him. On another occasion, after basketball practice, I had climbed into my car and leaned over the seat to put my backpack into the back seat when I was suddenly overwhelmed with the smell of my brother's cologne. It was so sudden and so strong, as though he had been sat right there. The next morning, when I got into my car, I expected the smell to still be lingering, but it had already disappeared. A few weeks later, something else happened. I have this bad habit of leaving the fridge door open, which used to drive my brother insane. He'd always walk in and shut the door and give me a lecture about it. But it was a habit I could never seem to shake. It was the weekend, and my parents had gone for a bike ride at a park close to our house, so I was alone. Around lunchtime, I got hungry and went downstairs to make myself a sandwich. As usual, I forgot to shut the fridge door and left it open for about 10 minutes. I remained in the kitchen this whole time, looking out the window as I ate my sandwich. I remember that our creepy neighbor was arguing with the mailman again. As I watched them, I heard a whoosh behind me, and then the sound of the fridge door being shut. By the time I turned around and looked, there was nothing there, but the fridge was definitely shut. There was no way it could have closed on its own. No windows were open, and there was no breeze. Plus, the fridge door itself was too heavy for anything other than a person to shut it. But I was alone. After the fridge incident, nothing else happened for over half a year. I used to take forever getting ready in the bathroom on a morning, which was another thing that used to irk my brother to no end. He actually ended up developing his own knock, which basically translated to, "Get out of the bathroom, now." It was the morning of our school picture day, and I was taking a longer time than usual getting ready and making sure my hair was perfect. I was curling my hair and was almost done when I heard it. Someone knocked on the bathroom door, and it was my brother's knock. I almost burnt myself on the curling wand when I jumped at it. I turned around and just stared at the door for the next few minutes, not sure what to do. Part of me was almost scared to open the door. Nobody else knew about that knock except for me and my brother. Not even my parents would know it. And yet, I was certain it was the same. Finally, I set down the curling iron, took a deep breath, and reached for the door. I opened it in one short, sharp movement, not wanting to delay any longer, and looked out. The hallway was empty. I peeked my head out further and looked left, then right, but there was nobody out there. I never could debunk or explain any of these events. They were too specific to my brother's behavior. I think it really was him, letting me know that he was still there, watching over me. When I turned 18, I moved out of my parents' house and now live in an apartment with my best friend. Since the move, nothing unusual has ever happened, and I still leave the fridge door open for long periods of time. My beloved little Pomeranian passed away when she was 12 years old, after a hard year of battling cancer. I had taken her to see the vet several times in that last month due to her worsening condition, but the vet could do nothing but give her medication for the pain. It hurt to see her suffering like she was, and so I had eventually broken down and scheduled her to be euthanized. 2 days before her appointment, she passed away in her sleep. I was told by the vet that it had been a very peaceful way to go. Part of me was glad she had passed at home, where she was the most comfortable. I brought Sammy to the vet shortly after to get her cremated. The vet took imprints of her paws and placed them on top of the box I placed her ashes in. For the first few weeks, I was pretty depressed. Nothing was the same without her. I know it might sound silly, but I ended up placing her urn box on my nightstand so that she could still sleep next to me, even after she had passed on. At night, I would talk to her and tell her about my day and how much I missed her in my life. I'd recount if I had seen any squirrels running amok in the complex, or if Mrs. Dietz's spaniel was causing a racket again. Those were her favorite things that used to excite her. Mrs. Dietz and her spaniel lived in the apartment next to mine. He would whine the whole day if she was out running errands, and it would drive Sammy nuts. When I took Sammy outside to do her business, if she saw a squirrel, she would get this serious look on her face and stand up on her hind legs, sniffing the air as she watched the furry creature scamper across the grass. She was absolutely enthralled by squirrels. She never barked at them or chased them, merely observed them on her hind legs. I would take Sammy everywhere with me, even when I went on holiday. Her favorite trip that I ever took her on was when we went to Hawaii. So when my mom and I planned a trip to Hawaii a few months later, I brought her ashes with me. After spreading her ashes, I returned home, and that's when a few unusual things happened. Around this time, the seasons had begun to change, and it had started to snow. We got about 4 inches during that first snowfall. I lived in an apartment complex that was only 2 floors high. I lived upstairs on the right, with Mrs. Dietz living on the left of the stairs. The morning after it had snowed, I remember looking out my kitchen window at the playground, admiring the large snowflakes as they cascaded down to the lawn below. I was not one who normally loved cold weather, but the first snowfall was beautiful. As I was leaving for work, I approached the stairway after locking my door and happened to look down. That's when I noticed the paw prints in the freshly fallen snow. I spun around, trying to follow where the prints led. They went right up to my door and then stopped. I was stumped. There were no retreating paw prints returning down the stairs or going anywhere else. There was only a single set of prints that led to my door and then just stopped. As though whoever had made them had simply vanished. At first, I wondered if the prints might have been from Mrs. Dietz's spaniel, but that was impossible. Her spaniel was 3 times the size of Sammy, and there was no reason her prints would have simply stopped at my door. And after having her paw prints put on her urn box and looking at them every night before bed, there was only one answer. Those were Sammy's prints. They were unmistakable, as impossible as it sounded. But I knew they belonged to my Sammy. I thought about that incident for the next few weeks and mentioned it to anyone who would listen. I was mesmerized by the whole ordeal. I never once thought I had imagined it or was going mad. Those prints had been clear as day, and there was no other explanation. It made me wonder if that meant my Sammy was still here with me, even after death. I got my answer not long afterwards. When she was alive, Sammy had this one habit with her food bowl that used to drive me nuts. She used to nudge her bowl all around the kitchen, almost as though she was playing with it instead of her toys. I was constantly moving the bowl back and tripping over it when she moved it again. After she'd passed, I didn't have the heart to pack away her things just yet. I left her toys out, and her food bowl was exactly where it had been the day she died, on the floor to the left of the refrigerator. One evening, after work, I was making myself dinner. I was certain the food bowl was in its normal spot, as I saw it when I went to get something from the fridge. Later that evening, when I returned to the kitchen to wash my dishes, her food bowl had moved. It was now next to the garbage can on the other side of the room. I knew it had moved. I was certain it hadn't been there before, and there was nothing in the kitchen that could have moved it all the way to the other side of the room. Sammy had done it. This still happens to this day. Some days it doesn't move at all, and on others it only moves a little, as though something nudged it away. Then there are some days where I can tell she's really trying to get my attention, and she'll move it really far away from its usual spot. I always pick up the bowl and move it back to the place by the fridge. That way I still know that she's still with me. I've never seen any more paw prints in the snow like I had that first winter, so that's a memory I will cherish forever. It was her spirit coming home. Some people say that animals can't have souls, but in my experience, I am certain they do. In 2007, I lost my grandmother. She was 76 years old when she came down with pneumonia and spent over a month in the hospital trying to fight it. The doctors gave her 3 rounds of antibiotics to try and combat the infection, but nothing worked. The treatment hardly even fazed it. After all 3 rounds failed, my grandma decided to stop any further medical treatment. The doctors suggested other treatments, but nothing was guaranteed to work, and my grandma was tired of fighting. In the end, she asked us all to let her go. I was heartbroken. I was really close with her growing up and shared a lot of fond memories. She was the one who taught me how to bake and crochet, and I spent a lot of summers at her house while my parents were at work. I wasn't ready to lose her. At first, I tried to fight the idea and persuade her to keep trying, but in the end, I forced myself to relive the last month of her suffering to understand her decision. The illness had made her weak and bedbound. It wasn't much of a life for her, and she wanted to let go. I understand that now, but at the time it was difficult to accept. On the week of Mother's Day, I went and visited her. The doctors had put her on morphine to ease the pain, so she was quite out of it. I brought her some flowers and a card, but when I walked into her room, she barely even seemed to recognize me. It broke my heart seeing her with such a blank, searching look on her face. It was almost like I was already losing her, and she hadn't even left yet. She wasn't the same as the woman I had once known. She asked me who I was and what I wanted. The whole time, I was trying to hold back my tears as I patiently explained why I was there. She seemed to accept what I was saying, but there was still no familiarity, no clear recognition of me. After the visit, I went straight home and took a shower. I had a date in a few hours, and while I didn't feel much like going, I figured it might help distract me from my feelings. While I was showering, I began to smell something. At first, it was faint, but it began to grow stronger until I recognized it. It smelled like flowers and sunshine, like a meadow in summer. I ignored it until I finished my shower, thinking nothing of it. Maybe it was the scent of my shower gel, or something from outside. But when I wrapped the towel around me and stepped out of the shower, the smell was everywhere. My whole bathroom was filled with this scent. It was almost overpowering. Part of me recognized the smell from somewhere, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I dried my hair and got dressed, the smell still lingering around me. Then I reached for my cell phone and noticed that I'd received multiple texts and missed calls from my mom. What I read broke my heart. My grandmother had finally passed away, just 5 minutes ago from the time I was reading. Then it clicked. That smell. It was exactly what my grandma smelled like. It was her scent, the one I had grown up with. I ran back to the bathroom, hoping the smell would still be lingering, but it was gone. There wasn't even a trace of it left behind. I truly believe that it was her. She was saying goodbye to me before she left. Growing up, my mom and I were really close. We did almost everything together. Whether it was cooking a family meal, shopping for clothes, or watching television, we did it all side by side. She was more than just my mom, but my best friend. The only person in the world I felt like I could talk to. When she was 54, my mom died from a massive heart attack. It was unexpected. There had been no warning signs. Nothing to prepare me. It just happened. And it turned my life upside down. I went from having my mom as my best friend to having nobody. I'd never felt so alone. I became self-destructive while dealing with the loss. It hit me really hard, and I thought I'd never recover from it. I'm not going to lie. It was a terribly tough time for me. It got to the stage where I would run red lights, hoping to get hit by another car, or walk across the street when the crosswalk was still red. I was eating poorly, barely sleeping. In that month after her death, I was a complete mess. I didn't think I'd get through it, but then it happened. One night, after spending almost an hour crying in the shower, I toweled off, got dressed, and laid down on my bed. I felt exhausted, in a way that was beyond sleep. So instead, I reached for the remote, intending to watch some television until I eventually dozed off. Before I could even turn the television on, a strange white light pierced through my curtains. At first, I thought it might be headlights from a passing car, but I lived on the second floor of the apartment building, and it wouldn't have been so bright. Curious, I stood up and went over to the curtains, intending to see what could be causing such a bright light. It was almost like someone was shining a torch directly into my window. I parted the curtains and looked out. The sky was dark, and the moon was full and high. But what caught my attention was the bright, smoky mass that seemed to hover right next to the moon. It was shining directly towards my window. I had no idea what it was. The edge of the mass was moving, almost like it was made up of static. It was so hard to describe. It was unlike anything I had seen before. Then, just as sudden as it had appeared, it faded into nothing. I wondered if I had imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. Whatever it was, it had been real. A light brighter than anything I had ever seen. I stood at the window, staring up at the moon for another 5 minutes, hoping it would return, but it didn't. I never saw anything like that again. I truly think that the light was from my mom. It was a message telling me that it was okay to let her go, and that I should stop trying to end my life because I didn't know how to live without her. It was telling me I would never be alone because she was still out there, watching over me. I was barely out of high school when my father passed away. I had just celebrated my 18th birthday the month before, and the news was devastating. My father and I had always been exceptionally close. He loved fishing, and out of us 3 girls, I was the only one who loved it as much as he did. I always enjoyed spending time with him, especially outdoors. Every time he packed up his tackle box, he would come and ask me if I wanted to go. He'd barely finish speaking before I would run and grab my fishing shoes and my favorite pole, and we were off for the day with our packed lunches and a flask. 3 days after his death, I was sleeping when I woke up suddenly to the feeling of something sitting at the foot of my bed. Groggy and half asleep, I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and squinted through the darkness. At the foot of my bed was a silhouette, watching me. Somehow, I knew it was my dad, even though his features were faded, and he was little more than a shadow than a fully formed person. I knew it was him. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice sounding loud in the silence. In my head, I thought I saw him smile. "Have the funeral on Friday," he said. "It will stop raining on Friday." That was all he said before he disappeared. I was confused and a little startled. Why, out of everything he could have said, did he care what day we had his funeral? I didn't at any point doubt that I had seen him sitting at the end of my bed. Even though I was half asleep, it had felt so real. The next morning, I went downstairs to find my mom sitting at the table throwing a fit. I sat down next to her, placed my hand on hers, and assured her that everything was going to be okay. I reminded her that she wasn't alone. We were all there for her and would get through it together. After guiding her through a few deep breaths, she began to calm down and told me what was wrong. She was fretting over which day to schedule the funeral because the forecast looked terrible all week, and she didn't want everyone getting all wet and muddy if the weather was bad. I rolled my eyes and said to her, "Mom, do it on Friday." She looked at me. "But it might rain on Friday." "Trust me, do it on Friday." She searched my face and, seeing that I was sincere, finally nodded. I sat there while she made the call to schedule the funeral for Friday. I smiled slightly to myself, finally understanding what my father had meant when he came to see me. He must have known that the funeral planning was stressing my mom out and wanted to help her out. We had the funeral on Friday, and to my mom's pleasure, the weather cleared. The day was bright and sunny, without a single droplet of rain. This story begins a few years ago, during the time my boyfriend Anthony's mom passed away. At the time, we had been dating no longer than about 6 months. Both of us were in our senior year of high school, and still naive to some degree. His mother was only 45 when she passed away. It was the worst thing I could imagine having to go through at our age. My heart truly felt for him, and the harsh and sudden loss that happened right at the start of his journey into adulthood. They had known she didn't have long since she was diagnosed a year before. She'd attended a doctor's checkup after she started to feel off. It was like her body was struggling to keep up with everything. Some days she would get really exhausted, and she would often experience waves of nausea and dizziness. At first, she assumed she'd contracted 2 different strains of flu, which had just knocked her body down for the whole month. But after Anthony and his father nagged at her to run some tests, the results were like a slap in the face. She was more ill than any of them had thought. Anthony told me that she'd seemed completely happy and healthy in the months and years before. Nobody had seen it coming at all. In her final week, she was placed into a nursing facility with around-the-clock hospice care. It was obvious that her time was nearly up. She'd been having a lot of bad days, and it had gotten to the stage where it seemed that the good ones were a thing of the past. I had gone with Anthony to the nursing home to see her during that last day. It broke my heart to see his mother look so ill. Her voice was terribly hoarse, and she could hardly get out any words to her son. He offered to get her a glass of water, but I insisted I'd get it so that he could have a longer visit with his mom. With a nod from Anthony, I slipped out of her room and into the hallway. As I walked to the nurse's station, I was scrolling through the missed text on my cell phone and didn't notice there was someone walking toward me. I almost bumped into a woman as she was going past. When I went to apologize, something made me stop. The woman, I noticed, was wearing the same clothes as Anthony's mother. I figured it could have been a coincidence, but as she passed by, I caught a glimpse of her face. It was Anthony's mother. There was no doubt. The woman had the exact replica of her features. She smiled at me as she passed, and I followed her over my shoulder as she walked down the hallway. As I fully turned around to face her, she disappeared, like she had never been there to start with. It took everything I had not to think I was going insane. Had I just imagined everything? Or had Anthony's mother really just walked by me? But she should have been in her bed, too weak to even get up. I quickly fetched the water from the nurse's station, carrying it back to the room. Sure enough, Anthony's mother was still in bed. I tried to shake off what I'd seen, still not sure if my eyes had deceived me, or if my mind had fabricated the entire thing. As I set the glass of water on the table next to his mother, Anthony turned to me. I think she fell asleep. When I looked at her face, she seemed to be smiling faintly, as though she was at peace. Maybe knowing her son was here had put her at ease. As quietly as I could, I sat down in the chair a few feet away from him and his mother. Almost as soon as I sat down, the machines that Anthony's mom was hooked up to suddenly came to life with a cacophony of alarms and high-pitched beeps. Nurses and doctors ran into the room, and Anthony and I watched as they went to the screens, monitoring the flat line displayed on one of them. Her heartbeat had stopped. They ushered us out into the hallway as they began performing CPR. Anthony was sobbing, and I was trying to console him, but I was still thinking about the woman I had seen in the hall. What if it really had been Anthony's mom? They tried for 10 minutes to bring her back to life, but she was already gone. To this day, I cannot forget what I had seen. Anthony's mom had been walking down the hallway at the same time she should have been in her hospital room, before disappearing completely. I know it doesn't make sense, and at the time we were going through a lot. It made more sense that I had simply imagined it. I never told Anthony about it. We've been married for 2 years now, with our first daughter on the way. I always felt that telling him the truth might hurt him more than it would help him. I don't want to bring up memories from such a low point in his life. One day, I will tell him though, and I hope he forgives me for waiting so long. My mother passed away right at the end of summer. She had been diagnosed with cancer about a year before. So her passing didn't come as a complete shock, but it was still devastating to us all. One day, while I was still grieving, I went down to the basement to watch some of our old VHS tapes on the VCR that I kept down there. I wanted to relive some of the memories I had with my mother, to ease the longing I was feeling to see her again. I picked a tape from one of my kids' birthdays and slid it into the tape rewinder to make sure it would start from the beginning. At first, it seemed as though the rewinder was working, but then it clicked off, as though the tape was fully rewound already. I simply assumed that whoever had watched it last time had rewound it themselves before putting it away. Thinking nothing of it, I placed it into the VCR and hit play. To my dismay, it began playing from the middle of the tape. My mom was smiling and waving at the camera, saying, "I love you," as she blew a kiss. With a frown, I ejected the tape and put it back in the rewinder. After only a few seconds, it clicked again. I knew there was no way it had rewound the tape in such a short amount of time. So I put it back into the VCR and attempted to manually rewind it from there. Even the VCR stopped only a short while after, acting as though the tape had been fully rewound. Defeated, I hit play and sat back. As I expected, it started playing from the same spot as before, with my mom waving and smiling at the camera. Her voice was slightly cracked as she said, "I love you." Instead of letting it play, I ejected the tape in frustration and turned it over in my hands a few times, inspecting it for damage. But there was nothing. No scratches or blemishes. I didn't understand why it wasn't rewinding properly. I eventually discarded the tape back into the box and picked out another, hoping I'd have better luck with a different video. I went through the same process as before, slotting the tape into the rewind machine and waiting for it to go back to the beginning, then putting it in the VCR and hitting play. This tape was from Christmas Eve 13 years ago, when we'd thrown a party with the entire family. From when the tape started up, it showed my mom again, chuckling as she bounced one of my daughters on her knees. Her eyes lit up with laughter as she bounced her slower and then faster, and my daughter giggled with those mischievous little laughs she used to do. But then, almost as though the tape had a mind of its own, my mom turned to face the screen, and I felt like she was intentionally staring right at me as she said, "And don't you forget it." The tape went blank all of a sudden. Then the screen was filled with snow as the next clip played. I hit eject on the tape and sat there, dumbfounded. Something was going on here. Although I didn't want to believe it, I couldn't help but think my mom was trying to communicate with me through these tapes. After putting the tape away, I decided to wait for a few hours until the kids got home from school and had dinner before trying my luck again. I needed to know if the rewinder really was broken, or if, in that moment in time, something paranormal really had happened. The kids got home from school and did their homework while I finished up dinner, but I couldn't get my mind off the tapes. "I love you, and don't you forget it." Was it really my mom trying to talk to me? After we ate, I asked my oldest daughter, Jenny, who was 17 at the time, to go downstairs and help me with something. She was glad to help and didn't ask too many questions. I was slightly apprehensive about trying it again, but when we got downstairs, I motioned for Jenny to sit next to me in front of the television, and I explained to her what had happened earlier that day. She seemed curious more than anything, and I was glad she didn't immediately think I was losing it. So you think Grandma is sending you messages? When she put it into words, I realized how silly it sounded. But it was the only explanation I could come up with for why the tapes wouldn't rewind, and why they seemed stuck on these specific parts, where my mom was speaking directly to the camera. I don't know, I admitted. I could just be losing my mind. Who knows? But either these two tapes are simply broken and won't rewind, or there is something going on here that I can't explain. I picked the birthday tape back out of the box and placed it back into the rewinder. As before, it clicked almost immediately without actually trying to rewind it. Slightly annoyed, I popped it into the VCR and sat back to let it play with my daughter beside me. This time, the tape started up a few seconds earlier than the last time I had watched it. Well, don't you look beautiful today, little miss? My mom's voice trailed off as she held my daughter, Jenny, up in the air and twirled her around in circles. Jenny smiled fondly beside me as the younger Jenny on the screen laughed and kicked out her legs. Then came the part where she repeated, "I love you," staring directly at the camera. Jenny looked at me, and I looked back at her, searching her face for any kind of emotion. Was that weird? I'm not sure, she said, glancing back at the television screen, which was paused on my mom's face. It didn't sound like she was necessarily talking directly to me right now. It could have just been the spot that tape was left off on. I understood what she was saying, but I was unwilling to accept it was something as simple as that. I pulled the tape out of the VCR and put an entirely different one in that I hadn't yet watched. If this did the same, then something was definitely happening. I motioned for Jenny to push the play button, and we sat back. The tape began with static. Then, as the video began to play, these weird horizontal lines appeared over the top. It was beginning to seem like this tape was a complete dud. The lines blocked the picture beneath, and it was almost impossible to make out what was happening in the video at all. Jenny reached for the eject button, but I quickly slapped her hand away. "Wait!" I hissed at her, leaning closer to the television. "Listen!" Amongst the faint waves of static, we could both hear the words, "Forever, in my heart." Then the sound cut off, and there was nothing but the static lines and messed up picture. "No way," Jenny said as she hit the rewind button, playing the video from the start again. We watched as the tape started with static, before moving to the illegible video. But those 4 words, spoken in my mother's voice, never sounded again during the entire tape. We watched it for a good 10 minutes, not even focusing on the video itself, but for any words. But there was nothing. No audible sounds at all. "Do you believe me now?" I asked her, climbing to my feet after shutting off the television and tucking the tapes back into the box. Jenny nodded slowly, almost in a daze. "Yeah, I do," she said. "I heard Grandma. That was her voice, wasn't it?" "Yeah, I think it was." That was the only paranormal thing that has ever happened to me in my life, or in my house. I might not have believed it really was my mom trying to communicate with me through the tapes if my daughter hadn't heard them too. Bean was my golden lab. She was nearing 10 years old, and a sudden illness struck her and would not leave. She was constantly coughing, out of breath, walking much slower, you name it. As hard as it was for me, I knew her time was nearing. Sometimes, I would hear her coughing after I went to bed, and I would lay down beside her dog bed and just rub her back. She deserved so much love. That dog was my world. I finally relented and had her put down. My heart was broken into 1,000 pieces, each one a shattered memory from our lives together. I did have another dog, actually. Her brother, Sven. I'd watched Sven search the house for her in the few weeks after her passing, and it just broke my heart. One evening before bed, I was in the living room starting to turn off lights and fold up blankets so I could go to sleep. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shadow of a dog walk into my bedroom. I called over my shoulder while folding my favorite quilt. "Sven, not yet. You haven't gone potty yet." A few seconds later, not enough time for Sven to hustle out of the bedroom, I felt his nose against my bare leg. I looked down, and he was sitting upright, his tail wagging on his bed. He'd never left his dog bed at all. A little creeped out, I went back to the bedroom and investigated. I turned the light on and rummaged around to find nothing amiss. I had to wonder, was that Bean? Was she still here? I couldn't get the thought out of my mind that night. After a few days, I had forgotten about the ordeal. I was lying in bed, watching some television, and had let Sven up on the bed to cuddle with me. Suddenly, we both heard what sounded like a possible prowler in the house. Sven was lowly growling, and I was shaking. I finally mustered up the courage to investigate. Once out in the living room, I flipped the switch on and gasped. I have a bin for all the dog toys, and it was laying on its side, its contents spilled all over the floor. All of the toys were put away before we'd gone to bed that night. To top it all off, Sven was sitting at my feet, staring off into space at the wall. I observed him until his tail finally stopped wagging, and he turned his face up to me as if to say, "It's gone now, Mom." I picked up all of the toys, placed them back in the toy bin, sat it upright, and walked around the house checking doors, windows, and closets for some peace of mind. Nothing was out of the ordinary. No one was in the house. Finally, this brings me to the last unexplained event. This one had to be about a month after Bean was gone. I'd felt cooped up with my grief in the house, so I'd taken Sven to the lake to have some fun. I packed a lunch for myself and brought a ball and some towels. Sven loved playing fetch in the water. Him and Bean could do it for hours in the summer. I was excited to get some time to play with him. Sven was having a blast jumping in and retrieving. After a while, he finally got worn out. Panting heavily, He sat to my right, refusing to budge when I'd bring my arm up to fake throw the ball. That's when I heard it. The whine. It only lasted a split second, but there was no denying it. It sounded like my Bean. Bean had a unique whine. She also loved fetch. I knew it wasn't Sven for 2 reasons. First, Sven's whine is deeper. And second, Sven's ears perked up at the sound, and his panting mouth slowly closed, showing his concentration on the noise. Sven and I sat there in silence after that for a moment. I wondered if he was thinking what I was thinking, and eyed him as the time passed by. That was the only whine we'd heard like that. I'm pretty sure after these experiences that my Bean stayed with us, at least for a little while. And I'm glad, because I needed her to be there while I healed. My best friend of 40 years phoned me one afternoon with some completely devastating news. She had been diagnosed with cancer and not given much time. Over the years, we'd both migrated around and did not live extremely close anymore. So we decided to make the best of the next few months and do our best at visiting each other more. Obviously, not long after her diagnosis, her health began declining significantly, and I had to be the one to travel to her more often. She made it 5 months. 5 short months I'd had my best friend the center of my life again, before she was off to her ever after. I was very sad. Some days I'd be in my PJs for longer than I should. Other days, I'd glance out the window at the sunshine and know that I should be enjoying the warmth on my skin, but I just wasn't ready to set aside my heartache and venture out just yet. It had only been a few days after her passing, and I would talk out loud to her, hoping she might be able to hear me. I was sitting in bed just before turning my light out, apologizing that I'd been so busy over the years and had not seen her more before the end. I'd turned out my bedside light and laid my head on the pillow. Just as I was drifting off, the theme song from Toy Story, "You've Got a Friend in Me," sounded on the stereo downstairs. I was shocked to say the least. I went downstairs to shut it off, only to find that by the time I got to the stereo, it was already off again. It was mind-boggling. Another time, my husband and I were having dinner. I had hung a picture of my best friend and myself on one of the walls in our dining room. It was from a time in our teens when we had gone to a theme park together and had a blast. We had just sat down to eat, and we were talking about my friend, her life, how much I missed her and how I hoped her husband was coping okay. The picture frame scraped a little bit against the wall, like it was being slightly tugged, then crashed to the floor. We both watched the broken mess with wide eyes. It was freaky. I wish I could explain it away as a loose nail or something, but we just hung it. And it had juggled a tad before it fell, scraping against the wall. It really sounded like someone had tugged it until it fell and crashed to the floor. We were both a little on edge after that. In fact, my husband would avoid conversations about my friend entirely after that. For example, I'd go in the bathroom to brush my teeth and start talking to him about her while he was in the bedroom. When I'd received no response, I'd rinse my mouth, walk into the bedroom, and see he'd walked out of the room entirely. I didn't blame him. It was freaky. I guess he just didn't know how to process what had happened. We were so close that, back in elementary school, we had referred to ourselves as the Two. It was just a nickname we made up thinking it was a cool code name. We'd hang out in a fort we made in her backyard. She lived on 3 acres, half of which was trees and pretty dense foliage. We'd found the perfect spot to dodge into and make a fort. At one point, we'd even made our own flag to hang outside on some of the brush with the number 2 on it. So this happened nearly a year after my friend's passing. I was taking a shower, and like usual, the bathroom was all steamy. I wrapped myself in a towel and approached the sink to brush my teeth when I looked up at the steamy mirror and noticed the number 2 written on it. I called to my husband to come and see what was on the mirror. We were both stumped. He was adamant that it hadn't been him, and we didn't have any children. There was no explanation for it whatsoever. Those are my experiences of my best friend. I'd like to hope that somehow it was her trying to communicate with me and letting me know that she was okay.